Hello and welcome to another episode of TV on TV. I'm Representative Tommy Vitolo. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group. Today is April 15th. It's a Thursday. It's not tax day this year. That's in a month, but it is my daughter's half birthday. So happy birthday, Anja. That's like half of happy birthday, Angelina. She's 6, so 6.5. So, the jokes aren't great. We got a great show today. We've got Select Board candidate Miriam Aschkenasy, and that's after the flip. But first, the news. Nationally, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine will not be administered for the time being. There is a rare side effect, but a serious one of blood clots, and for that reason, they're going to put a pause on it. Turns out there's a national shortage of ketchup packets. Heinz has vowed to increase production 25%. They should just check my fridge. I'm sure we have hundreds of packets there. Amazon workers in Alabama voted against forming a union earlier this week. The vote was roughly 700 and change to 1,700 and change. This was a major unionization push, and it certainly came up short. Here in Massachusetts, vaccination remains open for anyone 55 plus or who has one comorbidity. Beginning Monday, April 19th, it will be available for everyone 18 plus. Now, of course, you can pre-register, and just because you're eligible doesn't mean you will find an appointment immediately. However, I will note that Heinz and other local facilities have been vaccinating at a very high rate. And in fact, our statewide average is upward of 600,000 doses administered per week. Governor Baker has said that the J&J suspension will not have a material impact on our vaccination rate, as in fact, the number of J&J shots has been relatively low as compared to the other two. The House released its budget for FY 2022 yesterday. It's a $47.65 billion package that avoids service cuts and avoids tax increases. How can that be in such a tough year given the economic restraints of this coronavirus? And the answer is a combination of things, including the enhanced federal unemployment benefits, which of course are taxable under income tax provisions, and a variety of COVID relief package components that go to federal government and of course also to local governments. And that has really allowed the state to maintain its programming in places where it might not have otherwise had the funds to do so. The Senate budget will come out shortly, and then of course House and Senate will find a combined budget they are comfortable with. Yesterday, I joined my colleagues in the Massachusetts House of Representatives in approving a $400 million bond bill for the Holyoke Soldiers Home. It is in desperate need of really a new construction. Of that $400 million, actually 2/3 is picked up by federal Veterans Affairs, and only 1/3 will be paid by Massachusetts taxpayers. Sorely needed for veterans who are really suffering in the western part of the state. Here in Brookline, the elections are coming. I'll keep talking about it. Tuesday, May 4th is the election, and you're going to want to go ahead and figure out how you're going to vote for that. 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. The polls are open on Tuesday, May 4th, and you can vote early, absentee or early, technically, and you can vote in person at Town Hall during some of that time period. So you're going to want to check the town clerk's website for those details. Finally, although it hasn't happened yet, Dr. Linus Gilroy, the Brookline's new superintendent of schools, begins work on July 1st, and so everyone is looking forward to that as well. Without further ado, let's get right to it. Let's get to a recording from several days ago with Miriam Aschkenasy. She is a town meeting member from Precinct 13. She is a candidate for Select Board, and there are 5, and you're going to get to choose up to 2. So listen up, pay attention, see if she is the candidate for you. More on the flip. And as promised, today, this Thursday afternoon, we've got Select Board candidate Miriam Aschkenasy. She's a town meeting member from Precinct 13. She's been active on a variety of issues, and I'm delighted that we were able to get her for an interview today. Miriam, thanks for coming on Brookline Interactive Group.
Thank you, Tommy. It's a real pleasure. I love chatting with you.
We're having fun. And listen, we're going to jump right into it. Tell us about what you've been doing from since like birth until a couple of months ago, right? What's your story?
Well, that is quite the opening question. Luckily, I like talking about myself. Generally, I skipped that whole first like 30 years, but I do think it's important to talk a little bit about my family. So I am a first generation American. My father fled Nazi-occupied Austria, and he came to this country as a refugee. And that's been a very important part of my upbringing. He talked a lot about what it was like coming to this country and the opportunities that the United States offered him and our family. And I think it's because of this history and seeing my father's commitment to public service, because he felt compelled very much to give back to this community, that I learned from my parents the importance of working to make the world a better place for everyone actively. My father and my mother were very much about, you got to get your hands dirty. You have to do the work. You can't wait for somebody else to do it for you. And for 15 plus years, that's actually what I did. So for those of you who don't know, I went to medical school. I did a residency in international emergency medicine and public health. That's a fancy way to say I got a master's in public health. And then I spent almost 18 years doing global humanitarian response. So if there was a disaster in a low resource country, I was usually there. I ran a 700 plus field hospital in Haiti after the earthquake a little over 10 years ago. I provided clean water and sanitation for cholera response after a massive cholera outbreak in Zimbabwe. I worked in post-government upheaval Cambodia after the government change, in Mozambique after flooding. And I've learned a lot of really important life lessons working in these communities. I've really learned that my job is to listen and find middle ground and work collaboratively to empower the community that I'm there to serve, essentially. And actually, a lot of that translates into town meeting and into town government. I like to talk about that global humanitarian response because it was really pivotal in shaping me as a person, how I view the world. And then I like to talk about another really important piece of that for me, which is when I became a parent of 2 kids of color. And that just changed my whole life experience. I very much believe that we own our history and we own our stories. And I really had no idea how deeply embedded structural racism was in this country until I became a parent of 2 kids of color. And I own that. There's no excuse for that, but know better, do better. And I believe very strongly in that phrase. And so I actually literally decided I needed to know more and do more. And this is another example of how I go out and I actively change the world around me. I retired from medicine. I went back to school. I got a mid-career master's in public administration. I like to say I'm a lifelong learner. I've told my mother I can't promise her I won't go back to school again. I'm really going for all full 10 letters after my name. I only have 7 right now. I won't do it till my kids go to college, though. I have made that promise. But I was so profoundly affected by what I didn't know that I really felt compelled to change course completely in my life. I got my master's in public administration from the Kennedy School, and now I'm the program director for the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project at the Kennedy School. And it's really important to me that I actively work to make a better place and a better world and a better community for my kids and for marginalized people. Really, that's all I've done all my life is work to empower people. So here I am.
So what I hear you saying is you're not running for select board for the glory and the money. There's some other reason you're running. Tell us about that. Tell us about why you're running for the board this year, and what you're building your campaign around.
So yes, so here I am, a single mom of 2 middle school kids. both in the Brookline public school system, and they have been since pre-K. I work full-time. I'm the PTO treasurer. I'm a baseball mom. I'm a recovering soccer mom, a town meeting member, which you said. And so, right, the real question is why are you crazy enough to run for select board? When will you sleep? So, I think this comes right back to my history, which is I feel very much compelled to actively change the community around me. And I'm running for select board because I really do think we need change here in Brookline. And that change, it's not just any change. We need a government that reflects our values with a lens on equity, good governance, and inclusivity. And to me, I can bring that kind of change to the town. I can bring that lens to the work we do here in Brookline. It's not just rhetoric. I think you've seen from my life history that this has real meaning. And I just, having been on town meeting and seeing the relationship of town meeting and select board, there's room for growth there. And it's hard for me as a town meeting member to see this tension between the executive and the legislative branch that should be much more collaborative.
So I want to kind of dig in a little bit. You mentioned three things. I was clever enough to write them down. I get some things right on this show. And the first thing you mentioned was equity, and I sort of expand that to justice as well. And I know these are things that you spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about. And so I'm wondering, could you spend a few minutes? Look, we have a sense for what the national perspective is. You're not running for president, right? You're running for select board. So give us like a local sense on what the town can be doing, more precisely what the select board could be doing on issues of justice and equity.
So I think first I'll start with defining what justice means to me. And to me, justice means all of our choices have to happen through a lens of race equity and a historical lens of race equity. Nothing that we do now is divorced from what we did before. And I think we get into trouble when we think we can address race equity issues without understanding the history. So that said, a perfect example, and really one of the big drivers of why I'm running, is the case with Gerald Alston and our firefighter, who was treated very poorly by our town in a very racist way. And we had an opportunity to make things right, and we missed it. And this is really, we're to the point where we owe reparations to firefighter Alston, and we need to accept that we did something. We need to acknowledge it, and then we need to figure out how to make it right. And yet we are still fighting it. The select board is still fighting it. And so that's something very directly I would absolutely vote to stop appeals for that case and find a way to make firefighter Alston whole, or as whole as possible. I think on more broadly, we need to have an equity lens when we're thinking about the budget, when we think about affordable housing, when we think about climate change. We need to really drill down and say, how do we make this, how do we have our historical perspective, and how do we make sure that this has a race equity lens on it? And I just don't think we do that now.
And so it sounds like you're not suggesting a single action by the select board, but rather it's an ongoing, iterative, are we always, in everything we do, centering this. And I want to get into the government, right? So this is the second thing you said. You talked about good government. And, much of what the Brookline government can and can't do is governed by state law, and to a smaller extent, federal law. The processes, the structure of the government. And so are you thinking merely refining the way that the select board sort of handles its business, or are you thinking about something broader than that?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes, and yes, both. I think that how the select board handles its business, I think, to me, again, let me define what good governance means. So for me, it's thoughtful, strategic planning, it's transparency and accountability. And some of that is very easy to achieve despite any other legislation. I like to talk about the town website. That's a good governance issue, in my opinion. The town website is really challenging. It's very hard to find what you need. It's less than accessible. That's something we can fix. We don't need a whole lot to fix it. We just need to want to fix it, and want to fix it with a really sharp lens on transparency and accessibility and ease of use. Another example would be committees, how we decide who gets on what committees, how we look for those people, how we hold them accountable for their roles, and empower them on those committees. I think it's look, I know for a fact it's opaque. 6 years ago, I applied for the Diversity Commission. I did not get on. There were empty seats. They just didn't like my view on diversity, equity, and inclusion. To be clear, that was before the current iteration of the Diversity Commission is now. And nobody told me. I never received a letter. I was literally completely ghosted by the town. That's not good governance. Here you have somebody who's highly qualified with a special skill set. You're not putting on a committee specific to that skill set, and the answer is just not to answer. So that's easy stuff. That's accountability, that's transparency. I also think as we build policies, we need to build those policies with an eye on transparency. Another example I like to use is we're going to get federal funding for COVID response. And we need to be very thoughtful about how that's spent. We need a public input process. That's good governance. We need to make sure folks understand why we made the decisions we make on how to spend that money. And I just don't see that in the processes as they're happening now.
Got it. So there's a lot for me to be thinking about as a member of state government at the very least. You talked about inclusivity and as the third item you mentioned. And can you sort of, I'm thinking about how that relates to the website. I'm thinking about how it relates to committees, and thinking about how it relates more broadly to justice and equity. So maybe walk us through that a little bit, and pull it in.
Thank you. You know, actually, to me, so this is why I have a Venn. If you go to my website, miriamforbrookline.com, you'll see a beautiful Venn diagram, because of course I am a scientist at heart. And you'll see those three circles: justice, inclusivity, and good governance. And the heart of good policymaking is the sweet spot where all three of them overlap. And that's because you can't have justice and good governance without inclusivity. And again, I'm going to define what that means. That means you have to find a way not only to get everybody in the room. I mean, that's the first step. You've got to get everybody in the room, but you actually have to figure out how to share power. It means collaborating and consensus building. And to be very clear, I think when you share power, you build the power base for everybody, right? Sharing power actually makes more power for the whole community. And so I'll right back to the website. If you want people to be included in town government, having a accessible, useful, easy to use website, low hanging fruit, right? If we built our website for miriamforbrookline.com is accessible to the blind, we made absolutely sure that was the case. We really want to be thoughtful about making sure that everyone, I like to talk also about bell curves, that everybody who's at the edge of the bell curves, you're still under the bell curve, you still count, right? And so how do we make that clear, and how do we bring your voice and empower you at the table? So that's, to me, how they all relate.
And so, you know, I'm thinking about the week-to-week grind of the select board, and you know, these are big visions, and they're going to take some time and some convincing and probably some money. But I want to sort of think through the week-to-week, the Tuesday marathons, right? As you know, and you know, it involves warrant article reviews. It involves liquor licenses and victualler licenses and all these other sort of things. there's a lot that the select board does that's on the administrative side of things, I would say, as well as some things on the policy side. How do you think that week to week goes? What do you think your vision or your contribution is for these sort of, I don't want to say they're mundane, but they don't lead in the tab with who's getting open air parking permits this week. So give us a sense for how that relates to the things you've been talking about, and how your fingerprint is going to show up there.
Thank you. That's actually a great question. And I've gotten it, I'm doing a lot of phone calls and I'm meeting with a lot of people. It's not the first time that question has come up. I actually think that right now, without a strategic plan, there are a lot of inefficiencies, and there's a lot of discussions around issues that could be clearer if we had a strategic plan. So this is one of those moments where if you do the work, and it is work, and it takes some time to build a clear strategy that also has budget priorities aligned with your strategy, then actually making some of these administrative decisions becomes easier. I build programs. That is what I have been doing for the last 18 years. Even in global humanitarian response, I would go places where there was nothing and build a program. And one of the things I've learned is a clear strategic plan means you know when to say yes and you know when to say no. And then you don't have to take every decision and have a long drawn out discussion. Does this fit in our strategic plan or doesn't it? And if it's in a gray space, let's talk about it. I think the select board would really do itself a huge service and efficiency to actually take the time to have a strategic plan to help guide some of those decisions. And I think that applies to warrant articles. I think that applies to housing and zoning. I think that applies to parking, right? If you have a strategic plan that has a lens on transportation and housing, then you have some of those answers already for you. You don't have to rehash it every single time.
I'm going to push back on it just a little bit for clarity's sake. When we say a strategic plan, are you thinking like this is like a mission statement, a couple of sentences, or is this like a 100-page document, or right? Like what, when you say it's in the strategic plan and you wave a piece of paper in the air, how thick is that binding, right? It's not that I disagree. I'm just trying to understand, like, how detailed does the strategic plan have to be, for example, to tell us what we should do with the land we just bought on the top of Fisher Hill? Or should it just be general and trust that folks talking it out will get there? Give us a little more meat on that bone.
I think that's a great question. And the answer is yes, I think we need a mission statement. What I like to do is have a vision and a mission. Those are the first. And I don't think for a town like Brookline, it would not be difficult to create a vision and a mission. I do not want a 100-page strategic plan. I think actually that becomes counterproductive. To me, a strategic plan, you outline your vision, you outline your mission, you outline core values. And so of course I would want in that strategic plan a core value of justice, right? Inclusivity, good governance. Those would be core values. You could add, generally you shoot for somewhere between 3 to 7. Any more than that, it's not realistic. And then you give kind of, I would say my ideal strategic plan, and I've created many now, is anywhere between 5 to 10 pages. It is a framework by which you can help guide decisions. It is not, nope, the answer is right here on page 37, line 2. It's a framing, but we don't even have that framing. So I think that the answer is somewhere in between. We need a vision, we need a mission, and then we need to decide what is really important to us as a town. And once we do that and we have that framing, it also becomes much easier to align our budget with our priorities. Because one of the things in my work in race equity is I have become very familiar with the use of a budget to sustain the status quo, right? Fiscal responsibility is a very common term for we don't want to spend money on that because it's new, it's different, it has a race equity lens, whatever it is. And I want to reframe what fiscal responsibility means. Fiscal responsibility should mean our budget aligns with our priorities. And that doesn't necessarily mean that our budget looks like it did 10 years ago. It must change. In fact, I would argue that if we don't change, we're in real trouble. So strategic plan is a framing. It's the outside of the house, how we build the house. That's, you know, much more detailed, and we're not going to get into that. I mean, that's part of what the warrant article process is, but a framing actually will help guide the warrant article process, I think. So I hope I've answered your question.
Now, this is really helpful. And in thinking about the strategic plan, as well as the things that you talked about, which are not in a specific spot, you know, in the org chart, I'm thinking about silos. And in government, we have historically built silos, right? We have the Department of Public Works. And within the Department of Public Works, we have highway, and we have parks, and we have the water department, right? And yes, they interact with each other, but sometimes those silos help organize. Other times those silos help keep ideas out or keep interaction too low. So given that is the way we tend to structure bureaucratic organizations, especially governments, help us think through how you work in that status quo, or perhaps change it, with respect to justice, equity, good government, inclusivity, with respect to a strategic plan, right? How do the silos come into that conversation?
I think that one of the challenges that we have in the current form of government is single issue thinking. So if you have somebody, you know, obviously my issue is race equity, but I see race equity as something that overlays everything. So I will say, you know, climate mitigation, affordable housing, transportation, and equity all intersect. And a good policy will look at all of those things together rather than at one, as you said, siloed, just affordable housing or just transportation. And I just have to tell this one little story. It's just, never has it been more present to me, this intersection between housing, transportation, and equity and climate change, than when I responded to Hurricane Katrina. I was a consultant for Oxfam, and I was in the 9th Ward after the flooding. And there you stand there and you look at people who died because they didn't have buses. They didn't have buses. We couldn't transport them from their houses, that they were forced to live in a floodplain affected by climate change, much more so than many of their neighbors. I mean, that's it, right? That's the intersection of all of that. And I carry those experiences with me. And that's why I think the silos can be really, really hampering to good policy. So what do we do about it? Well, first of all, I think we stop putting single issue people in positions where we need people with a mind to learn. I always like to say one of my best skills is I know what I don't know. Right? I'm happy to say, you know, I had a house party, and actually somebody reached out to me afterwards and said, I would love to sit down with you and give you a tutorial on affordable housing. And I said, you know what, I would love that too. And I didn't just get one, I got several. And I love that. I'm a lifelong learner, but I think the point is, my father always used to say, you hire an expert and then you listen to them. And he'd say it's a surprising number of people who don't hire the expert, or don't hire them, or do hire them and then don't listen to them. So I think there's a skill there too, to say, I don't know this, please educate me. I think the other thing is, I bring from my global humanitarian response experience is, none of that work can happen if you aren't all working together. There is something in the international response field called the cluster response. So there are clusters. There is the security cluster, there's the education, there's the camp management, there's water, sanitation, and hygiene, there's health, there's, you get it, right, telecommunications. So all the clusters have their own meetings, and then they have tri-cluster meetings. So water, sanitation, and hygiene meets with food and health, because all of those things have their own little Venn diagram, right? And so we need to start saying, oh, you want to do a housing production plan, which we should do a 2021 housing production plan. We need to make sure somebody from the transportation and biking is represented on a committee talking about housing production. And also we need to make sure somebody's keeping a sharp lens on race equity, and climate mitigation needs to be a part of that committee too. So I think we just need to think about how we are putting together people and their levels of expertise. And that comes back, by the way, to good governance, which is how do we decide who's on what committee, and then and make that a really transparent, welcoming, and appreciated process.
Well, the voters have to decide who's going to be on the select board committee. Miriam Aschkenasy, running for select board. Thank you so much for your time showing up on Brookline Interactive Group. Voters, as you know, you get tired of hearing me say it. Star Wars Day, Tuesday, May 4th is the election. The polls are open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. You can vote early, both by mail and in person at the town clerk's office. And I trust you to let your fingers do the walking and figure out how to do that, or hear me at some other time. We're wrapping up. We've got to go, but it's been a great episode. Miriam, thanks for coming on the show, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.